This is the after show on our Simone de Beauvoir episodes. That's number, what, 140 and 141, I believe. And our regular, our regular host, Danny Lobell, is stuck in traffic and might join us at any point. But let's go through first. Jenny, introduce yourself. Tell us, you're the person who had studied some Simone de Beauvoir, who we dragged on as our token scholar, or whatever level of that you want to consider yourself, to help correct misapprehensions from getting worse.
Okay, well, I'm Jenny Hansen. I'm a professor at St. Lawrence University in the philosophy department, but the last couple of years I've been running our first year program, so I'm a full-time administrator at the moment, so my philosophy is rusty, and I'm glad that you gave me the invitation. So I'll do the best I can to correct misapprehensions, but I had to reread this whole thing to remember what she argues. So, but yeah, I did my dissertation on Luce Irigaray, but I did a lot of work on French feminism in general. So that's my background.
All right, next, let's just go down the list. Luke, tell us about your Noetic project and who you are and all that. Luke, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm here, man.
All right.
Speak. All right.
Yes.
I'm Luke Johnson. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Georgia. I'm doing a dissertation on Søren Kierkegaard, and I'm also building an educational platform called Noetic. It's an app. You can download it, and you can take advantage of some courses that I've put together and continue to take advantage of some resources that I'm putting together in regards to Søren Kierkegaard right now. Yeah, and I put together a whole course on Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity. I have some distance from it, so I don't have Jenny's recall or anything like that. I was able to do a quick study by sampling some things online earlier today, but I might be deferential to her as far as the know-it-all on the panel.
Let's keep going. Alex.
My name's Alex Park. I hail from Alameda, California. I professionally have no relationship to philosophy, but I'm a very long time autodidact. My main interests are Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and American pragmatism, especially James and Rorty. I am looking forward to discussing this text with all of you.
All right, let's keep going. Tiffany.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Reyes. I'm from Colorado. I went to school at Northwestern and I studied Eastern philosophy there, but my Western philosophy I've mostly studied on my own or audited classes in it and things. And I really like Simone de Beauvoir.
All right, and Brittany, I see you're muted. Unmute yourself. All right.
Hey. Nice to meet you guys. My name is Brittany. I'm from the Boston area. I'm actually a new fan of Partially Examined Life. I've barely been qualified to sit in the audience of this conversation, so I was trying to, just sort of like watch from afar, but the link wasn't working, so I figured I would just hop on and join, introduce myself. I sell software. Again, no professional association with philosophy whatsoever, but I've just started to try to dip a toe into existentialism, if that's possible. I'm currently reading The Second Sex, first couple chapters or so. So I'm very excited when I saw that this conversation was something I could join. So nice to meet you guys. Thanks for having me.
Well, all right, so that's everybody that's here right now. I know Danny Lobell just texted me, he's trying to join, and we might have some more folks jump on, but we'll proceed forward. I guess who wants to start? Well, Jenny, why don't you start us? Was there something glaring from listening to the podcast that you were like, oh, why didn't they? If they just covered that point, that would have really made it much more clear what she was about.
I wouldn't say that. No, I wouldn't say that in general. But something Alex just said reminded me of what I kept thinking when I was listening to the podcast, which is, since graduate school, which was a long time ago, I do much more work in American pragmatism, and so the entire time I was rereading this text, I was thinking more of just how. If you think about what her project is akin to what James is doing, like if she's kind of putting forward a defense of pragmatism as an epistemology or an ethics, then I think you can get away from turning her into Kant or turning her into some other kind of like canonical figure. She's actually, I think she's trying to do her French version of essentially what James starts. And then I think the reason that it doesn't sound more like American pragmatism is because James influences Husserl, who then and then her education is Husserl, and then she's also being educated in Hegel by Kochev, and so all of the language and the technical support of her argument seem like it's this completely foreign tradition. But I really think it's just a kinship with American pragmatism, and I think that's why there's so much there that's about pluralism and democracy and the individual and et cetera, et cetera. So that's something I would add, but I don't think that you necessarily got it wrong.
All right, and I'm sure that the audience members who are struggling to follow along even what we're talking about, like how could this possibly work? Why would she think that you care about others just because you're exerting your own freedom? I'm sure they were thinking, but if they were just keeping in mind the Kochev link, the American pragmatism link, then it would all become clear.
Well, I could say more about that. I'm giving you like the tiny little, but
Jimmy, can I ask you a question?
There, go ahead. Go ahead.
Luke, speak.
Speak, Luke.
Hey, Jenny, may I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
Well, sorry, was it Luke or was it Alex? He wanted to ask a question.
That was Luke.
All right.
Jenny, so my question to you would be, you're analogizing Simone de Beauvoir to James, do you feel like it's pure synchronicity, or do you feel like they're drinking from the same philosophical fountain that led them to a lot of the same conclusions? I'm unfamiliar with James. I tend to see where Simone de Beauvoir was getting a lot of her ideas from Sartre, Kierkegaard, Hegel, Kant, but I was just kind of curious how you felt like James may have been influenced by these figures, and if they're sort of going along these parallel lines, or was it just a matter of chance intellectual convergence?
I don't think it's chance, but I don't. So, okay, so this is where I am not a scholar of de Beauvoir here. So there's probably someone out there who could say, yes, that this year in her life she was reading, the pragmatism lectures, but she may not have ever read James. But James is a massive influence to Husserl, and you can see Husserl in this text, this whole notion of inner subjectivity, and even when she uses the word horizon in the text, that comes directly from James. And so James is the one who coins the term horizon that gets taken up in Husserl.
Is there a particular Husserl text that you think she is influenced by?
And I wouldn't be the person to answer that question. I think, what I think when I read, this is kind of answering a different question, but when I read this text again too, I don't really see her dialoguing directly with philosophers. I mean, she's definitely there. Kierkegaard is there because she's got Kierkegaard's critique of Hegel, and I think that's like the most prominent philosopher she's talking about in this text. But in general, I think she's talking to the politics, like the intellectuals and the different political positions they've taken up that have grown out of the sort of Hegelians or the Marxists or the communists. And so I don't really, even when she's coming out of like Heidegger, and I don't know that she ever mentions Husserl directly, I don't think she's it's not a scholarly argument. She's not kind of building on a text. She's taking all of these influences and she's building a sort of what she thinks is going to be a viable way forward, and an explanation of World War II. And so I don't know if that answers your question.
So what I hear, I want to just feed back to Jennifer just a second, because I completely agree with you that for me, when I read this, to me it was just screaming Kierkegaard the whole way. Like even her typology of sub-man and serious man and all that, which she explicitly acknowledges in the case of the serious man that's been well covered by Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Hegel and so on and so forth. But the sickness unto death and Kierkegaard's typology of the different stages of despair, I'm not saying it maps one-to-one with what de Beauvoir lays out here, but I think you could, if you wanted to, create a fairly systematic relationship between the kind of progression that Kierkegaard describes relative to despair and the kind of sort of typology that she develops relative to this concept of whether or not people are accepting or rejecting or fleeing from or embracing their freedom. So to me, this text was super saturated with Kierkegaard. But with regards to the connection to James, I do think I see you going towards what she really deals with in the third section, which is this attempt to take this sort of super abstract formal idea that clearly also comes from Sartre, comes from Kierkegaard, and then how do we concretely apply it to the world, right? Rather than it just being this abstract formalism, how does it actually hook up to political action? How do we actually apply it to real concrete situations so that we're not just writing these, these grandiose texts, but actually like dealing with real serious problems? I mean, there's actually a pretty good line where she's explicitly responding to Kierkegaard. I put this one in here, where she's talking about Abraham. Right. So she says, we have seen that this recourse to the serious is a lie. It entails the sacrifice of man to the thing, of freedom to the cause. In order for the return to the positive to be genuine, it must involve negativity. It must not conceal the antinomies between means and end, present, future, etc., etc. Kierkegaard has said that what distinguishes the Pharisee from the genuinely moral man is that the former considers his anguish as a sure sign of his virtue. From the fact that he asks himself, "Am I Abraham?" he concludes, "I am Abraham." But morality resides in the painfulness of an indefinite questioning. The problem which we are posing is not the same as that of Kierkegaard. The important thing to us is to know whether, in given conditions, Isaac must be killed or not. Now, I'm not sure whether she's successful in that attempt, but I do think that that's her goal, is to try, can she extract from this formal architecture actual guidance that will help us, e.g., determine whether or not Isaac should be killed, determine whether or not the Stalinist purges are justifiable, right? There's all these concrete moral issues in the world, and can we extract from existentialist ethics something that helps us make concrete, pragmatic decisions? Now, how that hooks up to American pragmatism is a further question, but that's kind of where I saw you going with that.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually really interesting. I think, if you want to go to the question of, okay, well, let me just say this, and then I'll go to what you said. So I think if I'm going to say more about listening to the episode, I think what makes me nervous is thinking of her argument for others and and sort of like the primacy of the freedom of others. Thinking of it as a Kantian argument misses really the point. I think it's dangerous to do that, and so I think looking at Kierkegaard or James or something is better. But going back to what you were just saying about, can we give some kind of guidance in real world situations that is, that's going to help us make a better rather than worse choice? What she ends up giving, I think, is more like certain characteristics of the decision or how the decision was made than anything like rules, right? So in that example there from Kierkegaard, I mean, one of the things that she's stressing throughout is I mean, Kierkegaard might call it like anguish or something, but the idea is that you shouldn't be certain, right? That it should be, it reminds me, I think it's in Fear and Trembling, where the worrisome thing is the person that sort of understands the choice to kill Isaac, like it was like completely logical, and of course you would do that. It should be something that would have been incredibly insane, and yet you were going to do it anyways, right? Like it's something that should bother you, and all those examples she gives of like if we might have to kill the young soldier, or we might all these things might have to happen, but they should never have been things that you could rationalize afterwards. They can't be things you should have been able to live with. You can't ever have been certain that what you were doing was exactly right. I think she's emphasizing that as a characteristic of how to make better rather than worse decisions, rather than say, as long as I know that I didn't interfere with the freedom of or the autonomy of the other, then I'm good, right? You could say more and more about that, but
Hey, Jenny,
Yeah.
if I may intrude here, and I want to defend the guys on the podcast a little bit. I think you've sort of labeled them as sort of Kantian interpreters of Simone de Beauvoir, and I wonder why you do that. Because, and I'm not trying to pick on you, because if I can recall the episodes correctly, I think they were saying, well, it has hues of this in the sense that she wants to respect individuals as ends in and of themselves, so that we don't make people purely useful or whatever. But I don't think the guys were saying that she was a Kantian.
So can I just put in, right, the two things that were the connections with Kant were the one that you just pointed out, Luke, that sort of the upshot, the generalization of her ethics, which is supposed to be pretty Nietzschean and pretty open-ended, and somehow it requires creativity, right? To positively figure out what to do, you don't have a set of rules. It's not like something that, a pre-Nietzsche sort of ethics, like even though Kant thought you could get ethics out of reason itself, the ethics that he came up with was pretty much the same, inherited from religion, traditional ethics. And Nietzsche just said, no, if you get rid of God, it should really mess up. It should really change what you end up valuing. And so Simone de Beauvoir, even though I think she doesn't have very good comments about Nietzsche, she thinks Nietzsche is a subjectivist and ultimately an adventurer, one of these types that she objects to, who's not properly respectful of other people. But still, she retains the creativity element. The part of Kant that comes in then is the again, what Luke just said, that, okay, well, within this creativity, you still have to treat everybody as ends in themselves. Acknowledge that if you kill a person, you're destroying a world, you're destroying a subjectivity, so that kind of thing runs through Buber and other existential type thinkers as well. And then the other thing was just, well, how do you get to the point of your respect for others in the first place? Well, it's supposed to be this is sort of the big thing we're trying to trace out through the episode, is somehow by willing your own freedom, you have to, if you're being self-consistent about it, you have to will the freedom, really the benefit of other people. And the way that kind of argument, I mean, it's not a matter of like, reflect on what you really, really want. Like, that's how we usually put it in terms of Nietzsche. Mm-hmm. But this is supposed to be something just about the structure of the will itself, that if you will your own freedom, then you are willing this other thing sort of just by necessity. And that was a very Kantian point. Of course, Kant takes it that you are in fact willing the categorical imperative. You are willing something, it's much more specific than simply willing the freedom of others. And but again, we were thinking you could characterize that still as treat others as ends in themselves.
Can I say something to that?
Yes.
So I didn't mean to kind of say, oh my God, you ruined her, you made her a Kantian, but I think it's just a reflection of kind of the way I think now about this work after all this other stuff I've read. And so when I think about her, if she's giving an argument for why the freedom of others matters, I don't think about it in terms of sort of self-consistency of willing. I think of it in terms of her recognition. It's a very practical reason, which is that willing is a spontaneous thing that just happens. We can't not be in the world and will, and we're sort of thrown in the world, and we have certain temperaments and we have certain directions we go. And she talks about obstacles and failures. It's very phenomenological there. But that willing needs content, and the content is what's inherited from where you are. Like, other people are supplying ideas and models and examples of your projects. And if there aren't a lot of those, if there's no plural instances of those, then you kind of, and this is me sounding like a Jamesian now, the world just becomes this monistic thing. There's no more creativity. There's no more future, right? It just becomes totality. And so I guess all I'm saying is that, yeah, you can make that Kantian argument, and certainly it's a fine way to defend it. But I think I just see her so much just talking about this in very pragmatic terms, that like we are in the world and we spontaneously are going to act, and we're going to act towards the future, and then we're going to face obstacles, and some of those will enable us to creatively overcome them. Some of us will try to avoid them because we'll be like, shit, I don't know what to do, and I'll just take the easy path. I'll do what my dad did. Some of us are, going to want someone to tell us what to do. And then some of us are going to be denied even being able to like spontaneously act. And, that's the oppression thing. But all of that, will be nothing if there's no content on which we're building. If we're not sort of like, okay, well, I reject the way that the school taught children when I was in school, so I'm going to create a new educational system, because like you need the content to negate. And so if you don't have others generating content, there's no future project for you. That's, I guess, the way that I see it.
Well, do you think that's necessarily true? I mean, how many individuals do you need in order to embark on a future project? I mean, do you really need to have, like, what's the number? But I guess I'm saying if you're waiting,
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if you're constantly waiting for like the magic number of individuals to contribute content to your project, you might be waiting for a long time. I think you just have to get going. But
if I can jump in here, I think I see what she was. I'm late to the discussion, but I really heard the point that she was trying to make. I think I can make it. I can make it sharp.
Well, welcome, Ken. Welcome, Ken. Ken, veteran of our other after shows. All right.
Anyway, so the point about needing context and needing other people is not so much that you need any specific number before you can get started, but that you start with some indeterminate number on whom you are dependent in a way that you can't understand until you've examined the situation very carefully. And that's the only comment I wanted to make in that. No, please go ahead.
Yeah. I don't know. I actually don't know. There's like a ton of daylight, really, Jenny, between how you and I sort of are interpreting this particular. I'm just kind of curious, like, if there were any other major critiques that were jutting out from the show that you picked up on. I mean, I think it was really ambitious what Mark and the guys tried to do to cover the text in 4 episodes. Yeah. What else did you? I'm kind of curious. What else you thought may have been lacking from the show?
Can I just jump in? So before, I just want to make sure we're including everybody. So I'd love to hear more about all the things Jennifer thinks that we left out and said wrong. But can we, Brittany or Tiffany or Alex or anybody or Ken, were there other things that what was your impression? Were you confused about something? Was there something that was nagging you?
Well, actually, I was struck in this de Beauvoir episode that you guys, all four of you, did something that you do uniquely well on this text, which is you like to take a certain amount of material and make sure you cover it. And this is one of my weaknesses reading a lot of philosophy books. I tend to pick out the arguments that are relevant to my own projects. But you guys really covered the book, covered the arguments, and I got a much better sense of de Beauvoir than I did before when I read her book in college, and even after having read a bunch of Sartre, a bunch of other existentialists. So it's a great example of how book-oriented methodology is valuable for all of us. So it was a very much appreciated series. Thanks.
Hear, hear.
Well, if I was to, I mean, the one thing, I mean, I think what you guys do is good, and it was a particularly good episode, and it was one of the first episodes where I actually resulted in me purchasing the thing that was under discussion. So, I mean, I'd say that was a success. But there was a hanging up period where you guys got into a fairly long discussion about whether or not. And I'm going to struggle to articulate this exactly well because it was about a week ago that I actually listened to this particular part of the podcast, but where it was, the discussion was, things in the world cannot oppress you. Only other people can oppress you. And there was a fairly detailed conversation about that I thought, probably could have just been summed up by the fact, which I think maybe from my point of view, what is implicit in de Beauvoir, but which you actually need to know something about Sartre to bring out, is that a lot of this is just about Sartre's ontology and about the in itself, the for itself, and the being in others, right? So the essential tension, the reason things can't oppress you is because things are passive. They are the in itself. It is us being for itself over and against in themselves that we have freedom at all. In fact, we're relating to our own thingness as conscious entities. The reason people can oppress each other is because we have that transcendent aspect and we can reduce each other to things. So oppression just is taking the transcendence of others and thingifying it. And that is what we experience in in No Exit, in Sartre's No Exit. The gaze, the potency of the gaze, the reason other people are hell is because when we are seen by other people, the potency of their transcendence is what creates objectification, and we can experience ourselves as objects in their eyes. And that gets exercised programmatically within tyranny or any system of oppression, or even in a moral system like utilitarianism, when people are thingified relative to ideals, relative to political programs, and so on and so forth. But anyways, that was my commentary on that little subsection of the podcast. I thought you guys kind of got into a whirlpool, but to me it seems sort of a clear outgrowth of Sartre's concept of how the self is structured.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great conversation going, and I'm glad. I don't want to derail it in any way. I'm sorry I'm late. I was caught up in good old-fashioned LA traffic that I couldn't get out of. So, hey everybody, I'm Danny. I've been here before. I've been here for all of them, I think.
So really, the party doesn't start until Danny gets here anyway. So, Danny, can you be oppressed by things, or just by people?
I've been oppressed by people all morning. I was working in a cafe, and then I was stuck in gridlock traffic. So I really do feel quite oppressed and ready for this show on oppression. It all works out well when you're serving people bagels and omelets and getting yelled at by crazy people. Yes, you can be oppressed by people, certainly.
Well, certainly, okay, so of course you can be oppressed by people, but actually even what you're describing, it's not people that are intentionally oppressing you, it's circumstances. So it's actually the traffic or the people going about their daily business that are just getting in your way, and that's being oppressive, whereas de Beauvoir wants to pick out specifically, the only instances that are really oppression are people intentionally doing things. Or am I getting this wrong, Jenny or anybody else?
Mark, I think it is. Mark.
I was thinking about it all morning because I knew I had this show to do, and I was thinking, the thoughts going through my head are that I was oppressing myself by being there, by agreeing to do this cafe job, and like basically, who is to blame? Is it the universe for putting me in a situation where I need to accept a cafe job on Sunday mornings? Is it me for not having the gumption or the assertiveness to I don't know to go out and get something better.
So Danny, I'd like to read a quote to you. There is no more obnoxious way to punish a man than to force him to perform acts which make no sense to him.
I thought it was going to say.
This is about making people march, right?
Yes, as when one makes soldiers who are being punished march up and down, or when one forces a schoolboy to copy lines. Yes, correct.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, something that I would like to interject. Something I would like to interject is that obstacles that we encounter in our affectivity actually provide sort of occasions for us to disclose our being with vitality, intelligence. If we infinite and have really actualized in the way that Simone would want us to. So I don't think an obstacle, traffic, a mountain, a whirlpool, or anything like that is oppressive in the same way as a person is. A person seems to have the ability to cut off all sort of meaning from us.
Yes, because only other people have the same power that we do, which is transcendence.
Right. Like we don't, and I don't know if it was in the show or somewhere else that I encountered where you don't you don't protest against like a hurricane or something like that, but you certainly would protest against a totalitarian despot.
So you're talking more about the guy who owns the cafe. I get it.
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting thing to take up with Simone de Beauvoir because she's very harsh on collectivism and she's very harsh on capitalists as well. Are you to see the capitalist? Are you to see your cafe manager as an autocrat, or is he a typhoon, or is the capitalist system itself something that allows you to existentially disclose? Which I think is really interesting because she critiques capitalism, she critiques communism, but she doesn't really, I think, give us a political economic solution to this outside of some sort of vague assent to democracy. I don't wonder where you guys all shake out on that.
She doesn't, and I think that's a struggle. That's a struggle for her in her development of an ethics, specifically. I mean, and I think existentialist stuff in general, like in Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, they're very much into the individual and trying to explicate and edify and show how the individual can overcome and recreate their own values and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And de Beauvoir is doing something here, which what makes her refreshing is that she's saying, okay, well, I accept this highly individualistic ethics. I accept that the individual is essentially the locus of all value. I think that's fair to say. And then she's like, can we, accepting the individual as sort of the end value, come up with some kind of way of relating to these broad systemic structures of society? Like, if the individual is the premier value, what does that tell us about relating to collectivism? What does that tell us about relating to capitalism? How do we turn to her very clear truth of the individual's primacy as the core value that we should all be pointing towards, and then turn that into a way of relating to these incredibly complex social structures?
Jenny, can you speak to that?
I think that's the reason why Mark's point about oppression was so important, is that if you have an ethical system that's focused on individuals and their freedoms, it's difficult to say that they're not allowed to do things. But through her thing about oppression, and if you can expand oppression to include systems and not just individual acts, then you suddenly have a world where demands can be made upon you to fight something that seems like it could be a thing, like a governmental system or a traffic system or something like that. Whereas otherwise, you could sort of opt out of caring about it and go about your individual business. But because it's an oppressive human-made thing, she's able to talk about how we have to interact with it.
And she's certainly sensitive, in the second sex, or not that I've read it, but she's known for her feminist viewpoints and seeing the whole, system, like the system of marriage itself, as being inherently oppressive. Maybe that's just shorthand for saying that people operating within that system act oppressively when, obeying the traditional norms. I have to interpret it that way, that it's not the system itself. So if it's a transportation system or the job system is being oppressive, it's just because people are participating in that. She's not going to accept, you can't say it's the Nazi system that was oppressive. No, it's the individuals who were, whether they were following orders or not, like that's what she has at the top of her mind, is why I bring it up.
It's all about what system the individual subscribes to. So make the distinction between the collective group or the individual, then, Mark.
Well, yeah, she's going to hold that even if you as an individual sign on for a group and say, well, it's the group, it's the system, that's just the way it is. She's going to, the big existentialist thing is to hold you personally responsible. You're the one who's signing on to that system, so who the hell cares where that came from? It's you doing it. You are oppressing individually.
But one of the things I think of here is the concept of resistance of the materials. So if each of us is expressing ourselves in our actions in some sense, then we have the same problem that any artist would have, a sculptor or a painter or a poet. There's some means by which we express ourselves. And when I say means here, I mean means in the Kantian sense. It's something that we have to treat as objects. Words or things or our votes or how much time we spend phone banking for Bernie Sanders as opposed to Donald Trump or whoever. And there's a certain way we can impose our will upon the world around us. But the world, whether it's animate or inanimate, is going to have some resistance or some inertia. And so when I look at any existentialist, especially any existentialist attempt at ethics, I'm always thinking about how to distinguish the ethics from an aesthetics. if the primary value that we're looking for is creativity and expression, or the primary content of value, I think it's a little too easy to say that the individual is the center of value in an existentialist system. Because it might be better to say that the existentialist is the author of value or the arbiter of value. But one thing that we're onto a topic here that I think is very important, distinguishing between the resistance of materials, whether they're animate or inanimate, versus the co-optation of our own subjectivity into somebody else's. And that, the co-optation, I think we're on the right track. The co-optation of subjectivity cannot be effected by inanimate objects upon a subjective object. It can only happen from one subject.
Did everybody get that? It was a bit choppy for me.
Yeah, I got it.
I don't want to go on too long, but if it would help to expand on anything, I'd be happy.
Someone's buzzing. I don't know who it is.
I think it's coming through from Kenneth every now and then. Am I wrong?
I don't know.
Okay, I'm going to mute myself when I'm not talking. Sorry.
It's okay, Kenneth. I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I think we all heard a big buzz.
I think he's got a spinning fan behind him. I can see, and then it comes, and goes right at the mic, and then it goes away.
I do have headphones.
Has anybody ever seen the movie The Burbs with Tom Hanks?
The Burbs?
What?
Oh,
Yeah.
no.
The Burbs?
No.
The reference will be lost on everyone then, so I won't even continue. It sounded like something from the movie The Burbs.
Clearly, Simone de Beauvoir had that in mind, though.
So could I just want to throw out maybe something that didn't really get taken up a lot in the podcast that might be worth thinking about, which is how Simone de Beauvoir's, how her articulation of Sartre's project is actually different, how she's actually doing something maybe more sophisticated and different than what Sartre is doing. And I think the most obvious place where you can see that is her constant reminder throughout the text of there are some people for whom freedom in the sense of being able to actually do their projects and be moving towards the future. It's not a possibility because of oppression. So she has a thicker account of context or historical circumstances that can curtail the freedom of individuals. And so I just wanted to make this point because so I come out of feminist philosophy, and there's a lot of feminists who are going to argue that individualism is a problem. But I think that in her case, it's not, because she's not arguing for this kind of completely autonomous, independent, non-relying on others kind of individual. Her individualism is merely just the affirmation that all of us have this sort of unique or likely unique take, or we're just different. And it's the interaction with that difference that is the likelihood of us making something new, something creative. But that some of us don't get to be creators because of oppressive structures. And so, it's not an accident that she goes on to write The Second Sex, which basically details all the ways in which women are cut off from this opportunity. But what's refreshing about her feminism maybe is that she doesn't then just say it's patriarchy. She puts it as much on women who have just enough of the thing to reflect and take up their freedom, as scary as it is, as anyone else. So anyways, I just wanted to say that I think go ahead.
Jenny, I actually think that's a really good point, because in the Ethics of Ambiguity, she does, she doesn't shift the dog to male. She actually holds females accountable for adopting, just like some men, the views of their husbands. Kind of an interesting maneuver. Perspective is what you think the positive upshot of her critique is. So, what does that sort of ideal sort of existential democracy look like, and how does it differ from what we currently have today? The reason why I ask you rather than others is because you're so familiar with how her work was critically received by other feminists and other existentialists. What does her I hate to say ideal because then I'm talking about unconditional value, but how far off from the mark are we from what you think Simone de Beauvoir would have wanted us to have?
That's a good question.
You mean as a society, as the way we should be?
Yeah, because I mean, in a way, like, do this. I mean, this is written in what, 1947, 48, 49?
Yeah.
So what's like? Obviously, a lot has changed, but what elements of oppression do we still need to eradicate? How is this book still relevant?
Yeah. Well, actually, the one thing that popped into my head, and this was something I thought of in, I think maybe it was the fourth podcast of the series, the fourth in the series. There was, I think, Mark, maybe you were talking about how the kind of necessity of I don't know, I can't remember, but it was something about like there's no need now. We're in this capitalist system, and so the forms of oppression are more coercive, or they're more not coercive, but they're more like hidden or more mystified. And I was thinking, well, just think of the Black Power or the Black Matters, Black Lives Matter movement. I can't even get the name right, but that we still live in a world in which there's police oppression that's very direct and curtails the freedoms of individuals in our, we incarcerate more people than any other nation, and we're supposed to be a free democratic society, and yet we lock up so many people, and so I think like there's still real problems of oppression, right? I mean, that hasn't gone away. And now we pick on immigrants, and we look at the Brexit vote.
And what about economic oppression?
What about economic oppression? What was the question? I'm sorry.
What about economic oppression?
I want to jump in on the question of an ideal society, but go ahead.
Well, so I'm kind of with you, Ken. I want to talk about this question of ideal society, but so okay. Yeah, the short answer though is yes, we still live in a world with profound economic oppression, racial oppression, gender oppression, sexual orientation oppression. I mean, oppression is still a real reality in this world, and so it's always going. I think de Beauvoir shows us it's never going away, right? There is no utopia. There is no moment where we all like shake hands, or we all like sing Kumbaya, and we finally form the ideal state. Right?
Jennifer, even if we got rid of oppression, the margins of what is considered oppressive would shift, and we would still have some sort of oppression. It's you can never do away with evil and only have good.
It's one of the ways to avoid your freedom is to just oppress, right? And to make people be like you. So
I think de Beauvoir is making a contribution to ethical reasoning as well as to positive ethics. So there's been a lot of ethical systems proposed over the years. Hegel had one, Hobbes had one. And one of the things de Beauvoir is saying is that one of the things she has to look at is all the counter arguments to all these utopias, and say that for every utopia, there's always a bunch of arguments against it, or arguments that it's unstable, or that it's unattainable. Mm-hmm. One of the points de Beauvoir wants to make is that, and there's a couple of very subtle things I think she accomplishes. One of the things she wants to accomplish is she wants to undermine the absence of a utopia and undermine the consistent use of the absence of a utopia for any motivation toward progress. So let me put this another way. So suppose the only way we have to move forward in ethics or in politics is to have a utopia and do our best to approach it. De Beauvoir wants to undermine that argument and say, we don't have to have a utopia, and we don't have to be approaching it in order to do better right here and right now in some specific way. So that's why it's an ethics of ambiguity, as opposed to like the beauty of Leviathan, or the beauty of the Prussian state, or the ideal Christian communist project that Kierkegaard might have gotten involved in. So this is one of the things that I think is so fundamentally important about existentialism in general and de Beauvoir in particular, and why she wanted to call it ambiguity. And in fact, I think of it as connected to what in mathematics we call incompleteness. There's things that in mathematics we know they're true, but we know we can't prove them. And if we had a system that could prove them, we would know it's a bad system. So de Beauvoir is saying that about ethics. We're stuck in this. Our ways of reasoning about ethics are not going to lead us to identify a utopia. But that's not a problem. That's a feature. That if our ethics did lead us to a utopia, then we would know it was a bad way of even thinking about it. So I wanted to jump on that. Right, it's a fair question to ask of any ethicist. What would be your utopia? But I think it's really important about de Beauvoir is that she has a very, very practical reason for not wanting a utopia, and it's a huge step forward in reasoning about ethics and politics.
I think this is just a function of what we're talking about is the creativity that I think started with Nietzsche that she's just expanding on. That once you think that there is no straight ahead, this is what human good is, then you could just maximize that, and that would be the utopia. That if you have a pluralistic vision of that, then I still think you could talk about a utopia just in terms of freedom from bondage, freedom from oppression. That's a very non-specific way of talking about utopia, but I take your point.
Yeah. No, thanks. There's one of the other things that I want to connect this back to Kant. I think it's fair to say that Kant had a certain kind of utopia in mind, and de Beauvoir is reacting against that. But on the other hand, one of the things that I find most interesting about Kant, and I think de Beauvoir and Sartre are still are using this strength in Kant's thought. When Kant wants something to be universalized, I think he has as much in mind the idea that some law would apply, equally to all people, the way we have our 14th Amendment. I think he also has in mind the way we can each influence each other. And in particular, there's a way in which one person can influence another, which does not negate that other person's subjectivity or autonomy. And that's precisely reasoning. If we communicate to each other, and we aren't threatening each other, we aren't bribing each other, we aren't distracting each other, if we're actually increasing each other's capacity to reason, and that's what we're trying to do in a nice philosophy seminar. Then we're certainly influencing each other, but in a way which uniquely does not reduce each other's autonomy. So if there's while there may not be any political system which constitutes utopia, there is at least a certain pattern of interaction which is devoid of moral failing, and that's precisely reasoning with each other, transparent.
I would disagree that reasoning is never oppressive of other people. You can definitely use logic in a violent way, use arguments, or people who are better at speaking then are going to be dominating.
You might just define rhetoric.
Sometimes the louder person wins the argument.
That's right. Yeah, that's the difference.
And I think if you're looking at even going all the way back to the Greeks, they had a problem with the sophists, being able to manipulate everyone. Not everybody is just going to trust that reason is going to be this perfect way of dealing with everything and making sure that no one's oppressed.
Well, the first person who made the distinction you're making right now, the first person who made that distinction was Aristotle himself. And he wrote one book called Rhetoric, in which he was very careful about documenting as many tactics of the sophists as possible. And then he went on to write his books on logic, which he hoped would be the opposite. But it's absolutely true that when people talk to each other, they can be manipulated. And one of the ongoing challenges of philosophy, going back to the time of the Greeks, Socrates is one of the best examples. How can you recognize that this communicative behavior can be manipulative, but then do your best not to use it for manipulative ends? And, and Socrates is struggling with this all the time. Is he manipulating his people who are listening to him, or is he really edifying them? And one of the most admirable things about Socrates is he leaves everybody confused. He leaves everybody aware of how confused they are. But anyway, the main thing I want to say about Kant is that one of the reasons I think Kant is so focused on universal laws is because he perceived logic to have this role, that arguing with somebody else would preserve their autonomy as long as you're not trying to browbeat them into something. But and whether or not that's true, and whether or not we can have an identifiable pattern of communication that, okay, I can listen to somebody else making a speech, and I can say, yes, that's a totally authentic speech. It's not manipulative. I don't think we'll ever reach that point. I don't think we'll have a utopia of distinguishing reason from rhetoric. So I just wanted to say that if we want to think about a utopia, the one thing that an argument like de Beauvoir's does not take away from us is the sincere communication, or authentic self-expression. Is you can. We may never get a political utopia, but anybody who's interested in utopia can act it out for themselves. Just like don't try to trick other people.
So, one thing that I think why I like thinking about this text after having read so much William James is that what William James often emphasizes about the way we should carry out our projects is to recognize our fallibility, right? So this is a theme that's massive throughout this text, the theme of failure or lacking certainty. And so I think I understand, Ken, what you were just saying about like trying to find a more ideal form of communication. Maybe you're not proposing that we try to better communicate and not, manipulate, which would be great. But I think it's hard. And so I think, again, that's why I kind of just look at this more like a pragmatic text, that what she's saying is that people are going to create things in the world. Their actions are going to express what they think is valuable, right? And they're going to produce it, and they're going to produce it out of reworking, taking up things that are there in their worlds, and either rejecting or making them better or going with them and tweaking them or whatever. People are going to do that. And sometimes other people are going to think it's great, and sometimes those activities won't get taken up or noticed or anything. They'll be total failures. But that we should never want to get to a point where ours won out, right? We don't want to be Trump, or we don't want to be somebody who has the vision, or who's going to have solved the problem, or who have found the right economy or the right way to make America great again. We want to just be all part of producing more options, more what she calls in many places open concrete possibilities, right? So the more we do what we do and create the value that we create and overcome the material obstacles that are in our way, and then reflect on someone else's ways and think, oh well, maybe that's better than mine. The more we do that, the more more cool stuff will happen in the future. There'll be more and more open possibilities. And so I don't know. I guess basically there is no ideal economy. There's no ideal, government. There's no ideal anything for de Beauvoir, because that would be undermining her entire project, which is to keep open this future that's uncertain, to not be able to articulate and define it. Because the minute you do that, the future no longer exists, right?
I concur with that.
Yeah, that's a pretty cool analysis too, and it makes total sense. You can't put it would go against everything she's saying to put it in a box and say this is how it should be. It absolutely has to be open-ended. It has to be. You have to be open to the possibilities for it to make sense.
And she talks about that a lot.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, she talks about that a lot.
I don't know if I can assent.
I don't. Let Brittany talk.
Brittany's saying something.
No, I'll just throw this out there, but from what I understand of this text, she emphasizes that a lot from the individual perspective as well, right? That's the whole lack that you're always trying to work to fill, right? Maybe from a societal perspective, maybe you are doing the same thing, which it sounds like more of what we're talking about from a government perspective, but it really sounds like that lack, that donut hole, is necessary for her concept of being. You are never complete. You have never reached the end.
Correct. Here, let me give I think this is all on the right track. Let me give a textual supporting reading here. So even Hegel does not dare delude himself with the idea of a stationary future. He admits that, mind being restlessness, the struggle will never cease. Marx did not consider the coming of the socialist state as an absolute result, but as the end of a prehistory on the basis of which real history begins. However, it would be sufficient, in order for the myth of the future to be valid, for this history to be conceivable as a harmonious development where reconciled men would fulfill themselves as pure positivity. But this dream is not permitted, since man is originally a negativity. No social upheaval, no moral conversion can eliminate this lack which is in his heart. It is by making himself a lack of being that man exists, and positive existence is this lack assumed but not eliminated. We cannot establish upon existence an abstract wisdom which, turning itself away from being, would aim at only the harmony itself of the existence. For it is then that the absolute silence of the in itself, which would close up around this negation of negativity without this particular movement, which thrusts him towards the future, man would not exist. But then one cannot imagine any reconciliation of transcendences. They do not have the indifferent docility of a pure abstraction. They are concrete and concretely compete with others for being. The world which they reveal is a battlefield where there is no neutral ground and which cannot be divided into parcels, for each individual project is asserted through the world as a whole.
Yep.
All right.
That's like John Stuart Mill's phrase, experiments in living, right? I mean, there's a way in which we are all conducting an experiment. There's an experimentalism to our action. And the better we are all off, the more the experiments get to flourish, right?
Right, and that's kind of what I was saying earlier, why I think for her, I mean, it can be misconstrued. When I say the individual is the highest value, that I can see how that may not quite capture it. It's that within each individual is a project, each individual is an eruption, an event, and each individual in conflict and in cooperation with other individuals, out of that sort of chaotic creative soup is what everything else, including all of these causes and ideologies and dreams of the future and how we all ought to get along in some sort of ideal state, all that is erupting out of that those core projects. And she just sort of over and over again reasserts that at the end of the day, it all comes down to each individual either accepting or rejecting their freedom, either promoting or crushing the freedom of others, and I think that's what makes this text so invigorating in the dimensions where it's good, is that she kind of ruthlessly just sort of comes back to that again and again and just says, yeah, you're just never going to get away from the fact that we're all just, in and of yourself, you have to focus on you have to take up your own freedom. You can't run away from it. And insofar as you're interacting with others, you must help them to become more free, because that will help you become more free, right? Like but to the point, not because it's like selfish altruism, but that they're like inextricably somehow the same freedom.
There's more content available for you to negate or act against the more people are producing their own projects, right? So you need that content in the world. And I mean, there's one other thing I wanted to mention that I think just on the de Beauvoir text that I think is unfortunate is that sometimes I think her own choice of words, or at least the translator's choice of words, gets in the way of understanding the project. Because in a way, when she talks about like choice and action, you immediately conjure in your head someone who's sort of reflected already theoretically or contemplated what they want to do with their life, and now I'm going to go and do it. But de Beauvoir's not really talking about choice that way all the time. I mean, a lot of what she's saying is that you're already acting. You're already doing something. There is no not acting unless you work really hard at it. And she even, I'm just going to read it. This is a passage, and I can't tell you where it's from because I had to read it off the Kindle. But this is a passage in the third part, but she says, "But the present is not a potential past. It is the moment of choice and action. We cannot avoid living it through a project. And there's no project which is purely contemplative, since one always projects himself towards something." And then later on she says, "Man never contemplates, he does." So there's that sense in de Beauvoir that's very deep in the existentialist pragmatic phenomenological tradition, which is we're primarily doers. Yep. We're doing things. And we only reflect when we fail, right? That's the only time we start thinking about what we should do. Because, oh shit, that wasn't, like, I can't do this anymore. That's like, the classic Heidegger hammer example, So I think basically that when she uses things like choice, it almost seems like it's this very kind of like meta reflection that's going on, but sometimes it's just that you're moving, you're moving forward rather than reflecting on what you're doing. I don't know how to put that differently.
I think you're right about James, though, because it's funny because I didn't even consider, most of the time I was reading this, I was thinking about Kierkegaard, but when you started talking about James, I think you're right that it has to do with, she brings up use a lot, right? Mm-hmm. And I haven't that was not my primary thing that I was following when I was trying to do a relatively close reading of this, but the core of what she's saying is that use, if it ever gets disconnected from the vital center of somebody's individual product where the values are being authored in their freedom, that use just becomes a thingifying force. But when she does talk about use as being anchored in that way, that is Jamesian. That is how James views that. That's what pragmatism is for James, right? Like what we need to get done is our projects in the world. Yep.
Like the question is useful for what, right? That's James.
Right, exactly. Useful
like, okay, that might be useful, but for what? What are you trying to do? And de Beauvoir's cautioning in a way that James couldn't have because the technology wasn't there, but de Beauvoir's cautioning the ways in which our technology starts dictating the end, right? Because it can achieve so much. We stop being the ones who author the ends, and we let what our technology do. This is happening all the time in all sorts of industries, right? I mean, if we can use big statistics to make predictions, then every problem has to be formulated that way. So I mean, basically,
big data.
There's this sense in which it's technology is going to start becoming the goal. It's gonna that's the kind of utilitarian concern she has. Everything's going to be about efficiency and time saving. And her question is, but for what? Like, so you're saving time and you're getting shit done faster. Why? So then you can go and then do more shit and like save more time, or so you can buy the Frigidaire, or I mean, for her it's like useful should only be in relation to your temperament, your project, your creativity. Is it useful for furthering that project?
Yep.
Okay, I've talked too much, sorry.
I want to bring up a couple things just from people's comments about this. I guess one was, as soon as you say ethics is creative, then it brings to mind, well, what prevents your ethics from being, well, it's creativity, but it ends up being destructive of somebody else's. So is this it's creativity within the, was I correct, sort of after you fulfilled the treating everybody as an ends and not merely as means, beyond that it's creative, but there's sort of a floor. Is that
there's different types of destructiveness to it.
Yeah.
Like there's some ethics that ought to be destroyed, right? There's some ethics that we need to, like, as her constant example to the Nazis or whatever, there was a certain ideology and an ethics in place there that ought to be overthrown. But then there are other types, there's other types of ethics that's supposed to be encouraged. So I don't know. I don't know. I think that's something worth taking into consideration when trying to address that issue.
Well, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and I don't think that she would say, let's not argue or disagree or like violently reject each other and each other's projects and thoughts. I mean, I love this one line she has buried in there about why it's so much harder to be the artist than the critic, you know, because like anything you produce is going to be like, oh, that was shitty or that sucked or I could do better, right? That's just that's the anguish of creating, that you're putting yourself at risk, and people are going to say like, I hate that, or it's terrible. And that's why a lot of us just keep reading and procrastinate and not write it until we've got it perfect and no one's going to like attack us, you know. But I think there is no avoiding. Your creative act is always going to stomp sometimes on others, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's oppression, right? It's only oppression if you prevent them from creating.
Totally. Well, something I wanted to interject here. I think we kind of consider this to be a settled matter, but it really isn't for me, because I see there seems to be this uniformity that like we cannot define the future for Simone de Beauvoir, and I actually think, I don't know if that's necessarily true. It seems like there's going to be some parameters that allow for this flourishing rather than others. So the question then becomes like, what sort of minimal structures can be in place that would allow for this? I don't know if we ever fully addressed this. I'm just kind of concerned that maybe everybody agreed a little too quickly that anarchy is going to be something that she would ascend to, and I don't think that would be necessarily the case. I think it's going to be like a really minimal form of democracy.
Yeah.
Limited democracy.
I don't even think that she's argued for minimalism.
No, I was trying to address exactly that question. You know, and one of the things I have in mind when I talk about this is some of the tradition that comes out of existentialism, especially Buber and Levinas. You can look at individual interactions between just two people or people in a small group, just exactly like this. And we can ask, what is a positive form for our own discussion to take? And each individual can ask themselves, what is a positive form for my communication to someone else? What form do I want that to take? And I think it's totally apt. There's hardly anything, actually, I think it's more important than to point out how one person can dominate another in a conversation. One person can deceive another in a business transaction, or somebody can, lead a mob with a political speech and, devastate a society by means of nothing other than expressing themselves. And my own personal opinion is that something started in Kant and was picked up. I think it was sort of skipped over in Hegel, but I think it was picked up again in the existentialists, which is the importance of authenticity in communication. Just, Sartre, at the end of Being in Nothingness, is expressing himself just in pain. He wishes he could get something more ethical out of the concept of authenticity, but he sort of leaves. He leaves Being in Nothingness with this unfinished promise that someday he's going to write a book about ethics, and it's all going to be based on authenticity. But he never got there. And I see, one of the things I try to read into Ethics of Ambiguity is the fulfillment of that promise. And I actually think it does pretty well. But I think it's an answer to exactly the question you're asking. What is this element of a positive community that we need to realize this each other's freedom and contribute to each other's freedom? And it's precisely this authentic communication. And here's a really, I guess a lot of us can agree on it when we put it in those terms, that authentic communication is respecting of each other's freedom. But I want to make the other point, which I think comes out of Kant, which is that being really careful with your logic and your data, being transparent about it, and being very, very rigorous in the arguments you offer to each other, that's actually a part of respecting each other's autonomy. So, avoiding rhetorical tropes and instead using rigorous, simple steps in an argument. That's part of making a respectful communication, to make sure that you're not manipulating something. giving them the opportunity to object to you.
One of the things I keep thinking about this creativity in ethics is that actually a lot of it amounts to the same thing as phronesis for Aristotle. So that is practical wisdom. I think I'm remembering the right Greek word, right? Phronesis.
Yeah.
That's the right word, but I don't know about that.
Yeah,
I agree with you.
well, so what this is supposed to mean.
Sure.
I mean, Aristotle didn't provide a strict, here are the rules that you have to follow either. That was not his kind of ethics. It was, and we characterize in the podcast Nietzsche, sort of as providing the forerunners of existentialist ethics, is really running, as kind of reviving, giving a version of the same kind of virtue ethics. So we're shooting at virtue, but virtue is not precisely defined. It's not like, what would Jesus do? It's like, well, Jesus is one example of an amazing way you could make yourself, but then there are all these other ways that, and in fact, be creative about that. And what phronesis amounts to is that even if you had a set of a set of rules, you still kind of have to have judgment of like, how exactly do you apply that. And one of the things that Simone de Beauvoir in particular, she in the second section on ethical conflicts was saying it's kind of like if even if you have a general will to do good for people, like this is part of your project, is you're going to do good for people. Well, there's still a question of to what extent do you simply ask them, what do you want? Okay, I'll do that. That's doing good for you. And to what extent do you kind of figure out, and no, actually, I think that I know better than you because you've been oppressed by the system, and so I'm going to try to break you out of your box and kind of introduce you to some larger world than you would ask for. And so that sort of practical wisdom of figuring out on a case-by-case basis, when I'm talking to somebody, when I'm trying to help somebody, you're trying to help your kid, you're trying to help one of your students, whatever, how much do you sort of go over their head and how much do you take their word for it? And it becomes, what's the best way to respect their dignity? Is it to get their explicit choice, or is it to really figure out, if you can, what would be good for them and to do that?
This is what the British needed last week.
Yeah. Well, it's like people really often don't know what's best for them, as Mark was pointing out. But how are you to determine if you know what's best for the person? If somebody says, yeah, this is what I want, and you can say, all right, if it's a clear case, like where it's a heroin addict, and he says, I want more heroin, and you can say, look, if this is killing him, yeah, I don't think that I should continue giving it to him. Even that's not so clear, because if you take him off it completely, you might kill him like that. But
well, that's why I was putting in terms of practical wisdom, that you have to actually have experience with heroin addicts to figure out in that case. I mean, it always implies not just that I'm just taking it upon myself, of course I know it's better than you, your interest, but that you have some sort of prior experience and that we get better at this kind of thing over time as we deal with more people and more situations.
I think that's really problematic, though. Like, if you're going to take a paternal role, you're kind of necessarily turning people into objects whenever you start trying to tell them what's better for them. So I think really, like, it's essential to her system that you recognize everybody's free and allowed to make really poor choices, if that's what they want to do.
Well, yeah, they can make poor choices, but you have to assist their poor choices?
How do you educate them?
Yeah, she does say, I mean, as we made it clear on the podcast, like, really because of this, you ultimately want to respect their freedom, the most you can do is expose them to, the right choice. But really, like, how aggressive should you be in kind of putting that in front of them? And that's, to not be paternalistic.
That's why I think that when you were talking about the definition of oppression, it's really important, because if you define oppression as, like, if you just kind of sit back and allow people to make poor decisions, are you oppressing them because you didn't do anything about it? Then you end up in a system where you end up having to take really fascist actions in order to control what people are doing. But if you see oppression as, like, you're only oppressive whenever you're actually doing something that limits them, then as long as you're not limiting them, you're not even responsible for educating them, because you're not limiting them. They could educate themselves theoretically.
Well, except I mean, I hear what you're saying, but where she covers that is that, and I think this hooks up to the general question of, like, somehow, and I think I think this is an area where things get a little mysterious, but that we're obligated to maximize the freedom of all people. And so she posits that there's certain people, children are one of her examples as a natural example of this, meaning children in the early stages of childhood are not free because they're totally immediate creatures, they're reflexive, they just immediately respond to their environment. And then she says, and for in her time, like some women, obviously that's culturally created, but give themselves over to the subordinate position. Slaves may give themselves over to the subordinate position. Workers who are in a state of mystification may give themselves over to a subordinate position. So in those cases, do you just let do you let the workers stay mystified? Do you not try to get the women to resist their oppression by the patriarchy? Do you just passively sit there? Do you not try to get children to grow up and take responsibility for themselves? So in all those cases, it's not necessarily of being paternalistic. It's the idea is, and this is the challenge, how do you get them to acquire more capacity to be free in themselves, to take more ownership over their situation and develop that latent capacity for freedom. That's how I read it.
Yeah, in fact, I think it's very valuable to bring into comparison to Aristotle and to value ethics or virtue ethics more generally. If there's one thing that I think we would all agree de Beauvoir would oppose, it would be the figure of Plato's philosopher king. She would not accept, just as she would not attempt to propose a utopia, a utopian constitution or a utopian institution. She would reject the idea that there's any absolute father figure that could make every decision for us just because he knows more than everybody else. In Plato's philosopher king, he not only knows more than everybody else, he knows enough to make things always come out right. So yeah. It's a highly utopian figure, and the book de Beauvoir is absolutely opposed to that. But one of the things, but I think Alex is making the point that there's many cases, very familiar cases, where one person knows more about something than someone else, and can therefore be helpful. And parents know more than their children about a variety of things. Teachers know more than their students. And I think Marx bringing up phronesis is a place where there's something right in Aristotle's concept of phronesis. A workman can know his job, a shoemaker can know his trade, a merchant can understand money, and each of those people can be more expert than any of the rest of us at their specific function. And I think one of the things de Beauvoir is insisting on is that sort of differential capacity is something that can function locally and immediately between two people, but cannot function across an entire society. We can't set up an institution that will make all these choices for us, or we can't set up an individual. It's in terms of political science, we can argue that whenever an institution like this is proposed or has actually existed in human history, it's in general gone very, very badly. The people who pretend to have all the answers generally don't. They probably don't have any answer at all. But for de Beauvoir, she doesn't have to use that evidence to make her point. She's making the point, I think, on a more fundamental level that the phronesis can get you from like a piece of leather to a shoe, or it can get you from a pile of lumber to a house, or it can get you from a pupil to a graduate. But it can't get you, the actual good for mankind, because that's something we're all creating competitively all the time.
Well, phronesis is an art, and it's about particulars and experience. And this is exactly the way she proceeds, right? When she starts to answer the question, what's to be done, or what am I supposed to do? She doesn't give a formulation like Kant, right? I don't think she thinks you can lay out principles, but you can look at cases. And she even says, you can look at these as a way to sort of like help you think about what you would do in a future situation. She says that, and then she also makes the point that, when you get, when people give you these kind of ethical situations, like save one person or 10 people, or, that these things are ridiculous, because what matters always is the concrete relation you have with the other person in which you're deliberating over what to do. It's very immediate. It draws on your experience and things that you've done in the past, and failures and mistakes. There's this overarching principle, I guess, and I just said there's no principles, but the idea is, to keep open the future, right? The idea is to keep that future open, and to keep the projects of human beings, which is their essence, well, they're not essence, but what they are, what human beings are, is projects and creating value. Keep that going. And everything else about the specific moment, specific circumstances, yeah, you're more like the doctor diagnosing an illness than the legislator giving a blunt instrument of law, right? So.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, if we wanted to look for a concrete example, I think the best illustration of both Mark and Jenny's points of when she talks about suicide. In general, she's going to be against suicide because it's going to cut off an individual from their disclosing or whatever, but they're going to be very rare particular instances where an individual's only choice is to kill themselves. And she talks about that ambiguous situation. I just thought that to insert that example might clarify the general point that both of you are trying to make about phronesis.
Yeah, I would also, just to add, it's not just dealing with other people, that you kind of have figured out through experience the best way to teach somebody or to raise their consciousness or something, but also the art of being yourself, thinking about Nietzsche's formulation. I forget exactly how it goes, but, something about growing into yourself. There's some famous quote that's along those lines. But the way to do that is to kind of look at your own nature and your experience with yourself, to kind of coach yourself to be the best kind of person you could be, whatever, and grow in the way that is, it's not a matter of exactly just figuring out what is my nature and growing in that direction, but there is part of that. So there's the phronesis is sort of knowing actually how to operate your freedom. Because you can't just do anything. You can't just say, I'm going to be a rock star tomorrow. But it's to intelligently juggle yourself into making yourself impressive, something like that.
Well, but that's kind of an essentialism. If there is something that you can be, then that would. It's hard to understand exactly what. That's a quote which is interesting because it's somewhat paradoxical. Becoming oneself, how can you be something other than what you are? But a lot of existentialism is based on grasping that paradox. That a human being is deliberately becoming something other than himself.
Well, maybe that's one of the ambiguities, that you have complete freedom on the other hand, but on the other hand, you have a facticity. You are who you are, and you can't just grow any which way. So it's
one of the hard parts about discussing existentialism. All of us are here in the United States. We're all part of an English-speaking philosophy community. So existentialism has comes out of this continental context in which more poetic forms of expression are acceptable, and it's hard to cash out as clearly as a lot of us would like just what they mean. But I do think we have to be careful about using concepts which have a hint of essentialism in them when we're trying to understand existentialist philosophy.
Because you're presupposing that you're arguing that existentialist philosophy is essentially anti-essentialist, and therefore, whenever you find yourself slipping into essentialism, you should recognize, it should throw a flag that maybe you're not being properly existentialist.
Well, no, it's one thing to criticize existentialism from an essentialist perspective, and it's another thing to claim to be getting onto the existentialist program and failing at that attempt. But since we're mostly trying to read a book and understand what it says. I just want to raise the red flag if we're going to use an essentialist idea in a discussion of existentialism, we should at least be aware of the inherent contrast. These people like de Beauvoir and Sartre are overtly setting themselves up against essentialism.
Yeah, but I think what's going on here is more. I don't know if it's essentialist, although I do think this is sort of a challenge in the work, right? If there's one thing the whole thing orbits around, and which I personally am not totally settled on. Well, I'll leave it there. It is that. So, for example, when she goes through her typology of types, the subman, the serious man, the adventurer, right? Again, I was reminded of Kierkegaard's progression through despair, which I, now is Kierkegaard as you go up the ladder of despair, is that landing you in an essentialist place? Like, I mean, Kierkegaard does believe that there is a God and that the ultimate that there is a telos to human life, and that's where it lands. Now, post Kierkegaard, other variants of existentialism, that kind of. Now, I guess let me shorten my blithering. Do you think if life has a telos, does that mean it has an essentialism, or are telos and essentialism, as you're describing it, distinct concepts? Because I think you could argue that Beauvoir kind of has a telos in mind here, of a kind.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I think every discussion of any existentialist always benefits a lot from comparison to Kierkegaard. Some people say about Kierkegaard that he was the father of existentialism, which would make him not necessarily an existentialist himself. Some people call him a proto-existentialist, which might imply that he is the first among a sequence of existentialists. And my own impression is that Kierkegaard is really struggling with a set of problems that come out of the entire scholastic traditions, starting with Aristotle into Kant and into Hegel. And he's I see Kierkegaard's main value as having clarified a variety of issues. And then there's a lot of people, including Sartre and Heidegger, who took those problems and tried to give them existentialist answers, just dropping the Aristotelian side, the essentialist side of it altogether. And I don't think Kierkegaard necessarily had that in mind or was intending to go that direction. So I still think it's useful to go back to Kierkegaard and look at his struggles with the idea of I like this. Kierkegaard sees man as very clear. Of all the things Kierkegaard wants to say about man is in the image of God. Well, the other thing Kierkegaard wants to say is that God is the creator. So now we have this problem. We human beings are created, and we have this. So we have something in common with our creator, and it just so happens that is creativity. And so I think it's. Well, that may sound a little too glib, but I think it's.
Well, so let me step back for a second. So what I was really trying to, I mean, I hear where you're going with Kierkegaard, but just to keep it focused on de Beauvoir, I guess, do you think her project involves any essentialism insofar as she seems to be describing an essential structure to human freedom? Like, to me, and maybe this is like, this is a little too in the weeds, but I take her as accepting fairly whole hog Sartre's concept of how human psychology functions with the in itself and the for itself, and that the space between the for itself and the in itself within the individual human constitutes this lack of being that she describes at the beginning of the essay. Now, it does the acceptance of that psychological structure. There are transcendences or consciousness. Consciousness aware of itself as consciousness represents a self relating itself to itself, and that gap is what gives us freedom. And from that, I will build an ethics, right? Between that ambiguity of man, of animal and consciousness, and the ambiguity therein. That is essential. And then but everything else is wide open, because that essential nature tells us is that we are free, and then we all have to figure out what project to turn it towards. Does that constitute an essentialism, or?
I don't think it does
Fair question. It's a fair question.
An essentialism. Well, so when people are railing against essentialism, they're railing against an Aristotelian notion, right? They're railing against a view Aristotle had that the end was contained in the beginning, right? That what something was going to be was already discernible, right? And that it was all pre-programmed in there. And, that there was no, if it didn't go that way, it was a failure or something. But I think what you're describing is, we can call it essential structure of consciousness, and that's not the same kind of essentialism that's the problem, right? I mean, we might call it, I would add, too, that it's not just this Kantian framework, but this is where the Husserl comes in and the notion of intentionality, that human beings are the sorts of things in the world that, no matter what, pre-reflectively are acting and valuing and creating value and doing stuff and completing projects, and they're not always reflective of that at all. They're just doing it until they approach failure. That, for her, is definitely an essential structure, but only insofar as it's like the conditions for the possibility of, boom, everything else happening, not in the sense of like, and it will lead to this ideal end, and this is where it's supposed to go.
I got you. Yeah, right. It doesn't. It is a structure. It is a describable structure, but the structure just. It's in the nature of the structure's not doesn't have a telos necessarily.
And maybe that's why.
Sorry, I don't understand how that is distinct from what Aristotle's essentialism was. If your freedom is already entailed, it already exists. Then the telos then is that we continue to will more and more freedom, or more and more creativity, because that's our essential nature. That sounds the same to me.
Well, I guess I just meant, like, if you think, so in my head I was thinking about the difference between, say, natural selection versus Aristotle's notion of things, right, his ontology. So natural selection doesn't sort of prescribe in advance all the things that are and how to categorize them. Things emerge out of mutations that you couldn't have predicted, right? But for Aristotle, everything is like already the way it should be. It's already what it's supposed to be is right there from its beginning, and it may not hit the mark, it may fail and be deformed or whatever, but there is what is, and there's no new things that come out of it or unpredictable things that come out of it. So, like, teleology itself is not the problem. It's a teleology that has a fixed end that is the problem. That is already determined. So freedom. I mean, again, this is a frustration I have with this text, is that we have such connotations with freedom that can sort of lead to misunderstandings of de Beauvoir's project. Because when she's talking about willing freedom, in a sense, it's like, it doesn't mean like I'm willing this self-assertion of my blah. I don't know. Willing freedom just means we're always already doing what we do until we approach an obstacle. We're just the kind of things that do things that are, very contingent and unique to us and unpredictable, and where it's going to go is dependent upon a lot of contextual factors and people we interact with. Like, we just have a structure that's moving forward and projecting, and that projection's not thought out in advance. That's all she's really positing in her notion of what humans are. But she's not saying some humans are going to be astronauts, some humans are going to be philosophers, some humans are going to be, there's no like definite end or fixed.
Why would essentialism require that everything is particularly determined in that way?
Well,
that's just the way Aristotle.
This is the way that say feminists would rightly reject a philosophy that posits that, right? I mean, she's even got that in her text. If you say women are essentially incapable of using the vote wisely, they're essentially incapable of reasoning, right? They're just not so constituted that they can blah, blah, blah. They're not free. Like, that's the kind of essentialism that existentialism just doesn't, allow for. It doesn't mean that you can also then it's not libertarianism. It's not like you can do whatever you want. Right? There's limits. There's material limits. There's the limits of your physicality. There's the limits of the historical situation you find yourself in. But within all of those limits, your motor. What you are is a doing that's moving forward in a way that's colored by your unique take on things, your unique temperament. So, I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, and you make it up as you go along.
Yeah, it's a lot of, and a lot of it's unreflective.
She's saying that we're essentially people who are already thrown into a situation and are always constantly making it up as we go along. That's our essential nature, right? And if you don't accept that that's essential to us, then there's nothing to separate there being more and more freedom or more and more creativity being any different than what you were saying earlier about why keep making shit so that there's just more and more shit? Why have more creativity so there's just more and more creativity? It's only valuable if, we think that we're essentially creative beings.
Yes, that's kind of what
That's a good question. What you're getting to, actually. Go ahead.
I'm signing on to Tiffany's project here. That's kind of what, because there's sort of two things in tension. One is, well, where does Aristotle mean by essentialism? And I think it's valid. Women are essentially the weaker sex, or this race is essentially right. All these essentialisms in which we say the structure is such and so, and they'll wind up like such. But
let's just see. These are at least historical uses of Aristotle. Let's not actually attribute that to Aristotle.
Okay. All right. But this is, I'm with what Tiffany's saying is, yes, that's kind of what I was getting at. Just as Kierkegaard says, well, our final purpose is to, we can either accept God or reject God, but God's waiting for us. De Beauvoir seems to be saying, well, we can accept our freedom or reject our freedom, but that's really what it's all about. It's just about getting more and more in tune with our freedom, and what that we call that is what? Autonomy, self-control, maximizing our creativity. I'm just thinking out loud here. I'm pretending.
Kierkegaard's ethical either or Kierkegaard's ethical either or versus rather than his religious ethical either or that you see later in the second authorship. Is what you're talking about.
So I think we need to be sort of heading into our final question and not go more than another 10 minutes maximum, because I know we had some time lost at the beginning and my dropping out and all that. But let's just make sure one thing, I'm not sure if this has been directly addressed. I know this was brought up. Luke was saying something about. Ken, mute yourself, dude. We were just getting that boom again. The
verbs.
Yes. So for your freedom to be maximized, to will your freedom, you need other people so you can have sort of stuff to react to. Real freedom requires this sort of interaction. But I think it was raised well, how does that go to actually what Ken was just putting as the ethical realm, where you're not just having a tribe of people that you're reacting to, but you have to generalize this and say every human being deserves this kind of respect. And because if you just need other people to bounce off of, that's perfectly compatible with a very stratified society, and I just need my equals to bounce off of.
Right. No, I think, I took you in the podcast, Mark, and I think for me is also an issue is, at the end of the day, while I really like a lot of this essay, I don't know that it has convinced me that I ought not to be an ethical egoist, say. Right? Why not just assert my value? Me personally, yes, I'm totally into maximizing other people's freedom because for lots of different reasons. I won't go into that. But in terms of, does this essay?
You were treated well as a child, weren't you?
Yes, I was. But I don't know that this text shows me that it is that the ethics of ambiguity produces an objective ethics or an ethics that necessarily and ineluctably sends me down the road of maximizing everyone's freedom. Does it do that? I don't know. I'm still ruminating on it.
I don't think that the word respect is even in the text. I don't think dignity or respect are words that show up in the text. I think that, in a sense, if there's an ethics in this text, it's the ethical imperative is to preserve the future. It's less about individual relations between each other and more towards preserving that open future. That seems to me what it is, you know. And so the way you preserve the open future is preserving other people's, or making sure you don't shut down other people's projects.
Why do I need to care about the future? And how distant?
Well, because if you don't, then you end up with fascism or.
To Alex about.
What? Luke? Luke, are you still with us?
What happened? Yeah,
I'm here, man. I mean, the thing I wanted to ask Alex about, if you're not convinced that I think you have to go back to like so much of what this text dwells on. Why you ought not to be an ethical egoist is because that will be like your marking, your etch upon the world. Like you're forever gonna be a bad dude if you choose that shit. Like, don't you? That's your contribution to the world, and there's no God to save you from the fact that you will be essentially a big or a little fascist if you adopt that perspective. Right?
But I think that's it. Like, being an ethical egoist means you've now made yourself into a thing, right? You've now made your project only about that thing and everything else be damned. And nothing else matters.
You're a villain.
And so you're not willing to be fallible. You're not willing to be open. You're not. But she doesn't use those words, right? Like, so you're not willing to. I mean, you become a tyrant, and therefore all those from being a tyrant, which is lots of bloody struggles and sacrificing of people as if they're just things and objects, and and assuming that you've got the right answer.
What about an egoist that doesn't turn into the tyrant? What about the egoist who becomes a hermit? Like,
well, I mean, that's one person.
I like that question because
that's a nihilist, you know.
Well, the one of the things I think Jennifer was saying was that you can be a tyrant on a tiny scale. You know, if just by being purely selfish, treating everything around you as a thing, you become a big fish in a little pond. And your pond can be as small as you want. You can be, in fact, a hermit. And if nobody else is making an impact on your decision making, then what you and the tyrant have in common is that you have no humility. You have only hubris. But one of the things I've been hoping to get into the discussion, I hope I squeeze it in right here, is that one of my own reasons for getting into philosophy was trying to understand how I can let other people influence my decisions without just being controlled by them, or without being, and then having to worry about, am I being controlled by them a little bit or a lot, or am I being controlled by the system? Am I being controlled by my past? So I have found this for myself to be an especially challenging problem, how to be open without being a thing, without being just, there's a phrase for music that I want to throw in here, for Mark's sake, if nothing else. The Abigail Hildegard of Bingen has a collection of medieval music called "Feather on the Breath of God." And it's very lovely music, and anybody who's interested in this podcast has at least some side tolerance for music. So I totally recommend to everybody listening to at least some of Hildegard of Bingen. But there's somebody like Kierkegaard sort of wants you to be a feather on the breath of God, and there's a whole lot of things in between. And one of the things I think de Beauvoir wants for us is to be affected by each other's breath. She wants us to be as open to each other as open to each other as possible, but still have some autonomy. I don't think she's totally solved that problem, but I think that's what she's working on. That's why I want to read this book.
Well,
hey,
let me just say to you.
Out of here, okay. Right.
I just want to say, I think de Beauvoir might have an answer to your question, how do I not just be controlled by others, although it may not be a good answer. But I think it's all encapsulated in this idea that, you know, I mean, this comes out too in sort of the way we raise children. If we raise children to become what we want them to be, this is a problem, right? We're not respecting their freedom. Children, the idea is that there's some kind of thing that a child has, or something that's uniquely that child, that's irreducible, that that we need to not try to like repress or mold, to like let it express itself in the way that it's going to and get out of its way. And so I think she thinks that all of us have that. I mean, this is what James means by a temperament or a center of gravity. We have this kind of hue that shades the way we see the world, that's uniquely ours, that all of us can kind of like interact with. And if ever you try to like not allow that to be expressed, then there's a kind of, you know, there's all kinds of things that could happen to the individual. They can either become depressed or suicidal, or they can become, you know, there's all that they become childlike. They, you know, you've like quashed that thing about them that should animate that should make them vital, their vitality or whatever. So.
Yeah, you've negated their freedom.
Yeah, everyone has their own vitality, and you have to let it shine, like, you know, even if it's against your wishes. And that's, if you're a parent, you know that, you know.
So I want to make sure before we get out of here that we hear some closing or summarial or otherwise forgotten thoughts from Danny, who usually gives us the first question to get us going and set the tone, and you weren't here to do that, so unload.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I mean, first, the thought that jumps to my mind is how, well, I'll even skip that for a second. First, I want to tell everybody congratulations on a fantastic and very thought-provoking talk. You know, when my job is easiest is when everybody is sort of engaged and doesn't need to push along too much throughout the conversation, which was thankfully for me kind of the case today, because I had such a crazy morning working at this cafe job, and I was here and ready, but you guys kind of carried this so beautifully that I didn't really need to jump in very much, and you brought up such interesting points. One thing now I'll go back to is one quick question that I'll throw out there before we put an end to this. And it goes back about an hour in our conversation, but I didn't want to interrupt because there was such a great flow. But now we talked a little bit about people who volunteer to give away their freedom. The example was brought up, somebody who volunteers themselves into slavery. Isn't that, in a sense, taking that away would be taking away their own freedom? So if there are people who want to be oppressed for whatever reason, maybe it's not a healthy reason, but if there are people who want to be oppressed, then sort of pushing them to what we consider freedom would actually be in fact taking away their freedom, correct?
So you're saying there's like a paradox. If someone, at a certain point, if somebody wants to, I mean, there's even a section where she acknowledges that. She actually brings up the drug example at one point, and she describes like somebody who keeps trying to commit suicide but is always prevented. The doctor patting them on the shoulder becomes like a tyrant that's like torturing them in hell or something. I mean, that's probably more dramatic than she says it. But I mean, that's in the.
But go on. She's big into doctors. Anyway, I'll let you get it.
Well, I'm just saying, I'm just offering a textual support for the idea that at a certain point, if somebody wants to do X, then.
All right, so here's where I think it gets a little interesting. So we've decided that this person in the scenario wants to commit suicide, and we can all sort of sit here and say that's bad for them. Now, what if it's a more gray area? What if it's something that we propose is bad for the person, but it's not 100% clear that it is bad for the person? Because there are things that we don't know, and that within one society would be drastically different culturally or something than another. So we could be forcing our way on one. here's an idea that comes to mind right now. Is the big topic is transgender. So society now is on the side that transgender is healthy and should be accepted, but it didn't used to be that case. So if you go back in time and you'd say, oh, I'm forcing somebody to do what's best for them by telling them that they shouldn't be transgender, at the time society would agree that you were right, but history would show that you're wrong. In that scenario, who is really free and who's being oppressed?
I think that you really only have a responsibility to take the oppressions away and not actually keep people from doing things. So in the event of like somebody wanting to kill themselves, it's actually not right to prevent people from killing themselves. But what would be right is to remove the oppressions in their lives that would lead them to do that, or like lead them into a space where that's their only option. And if they weren't being oppressed, the assumption is they wouldn't want to kill themselves. But you have to say that a person is responsible and capable of making a decision about whether or not they want to live, because only they can decide it. It could be their choice to kill themselves.
Right, but that again is a more clear-cut scenario where we can say, okay, killing yourself is bad. But there are gray area scenarios where we're not sure if they're pushing themselves in a healthy or unhealthy direction.
Well, that's where the
great...
phronesis or whatever comes in. You have to make a call.
She also has this great line towards the end, and it goes like this: man always has to decide by himself in the darkness that he must want beyond what he knows. Right? I mean, no one but the individual at that moment can be the one to decide, but the individual. And even the individual won't know exactly the right answer. That's the ambiguity of the situation.
Yeah, I guess I've been imposing the basic moral framework of Nietzsche on de Beauvoir. And so, remember, Nietzsche's not about thou shalt not. Nietzsche's about I will. So it's kind of deciding how you want to live your life. And so even the whole talk of, like, is it right to prevent somebody from doing this? Do they have the right to, like, that's sort of not, I don't think that's de Beauvoir's kind of language. Is that right? So really the whole way we think about ethics is not an existentialist way in general. And so we get to like, no, we have to determine whether in this circumstance it's right to prevent someone from committing suicide or not. Like, no, it is gray intentionally. There's no color scale of that sort, black to white to gray, involved at all.
I mean, she gives examples. She says there's the one time where you do it and it turns out that the life becomes better of the individual that you save, the woman, who I guess who ends up finding a better life. But then there's the person that you say, don't do it. And then they have a right to ask you, then give me a reason for living, right? Like, if you're taking this away from me, then you better make it clear to me why, you know? And I think that's man decides in darkness, you know? It's we can't possibly figure this out for the other person. And the other person has to figure it out him or herself, which is difficult enough. For us to presume we have a better sense of what to do than that person is egoism, right? Like or narcissism or something. I don't know.
Well, I want to make sure. Sorry, go on, Josh.
Yeah, there's I want to bring up this issue of the resistance to materials again. Because one, there's two kinds of problems that I see de Beauvoir raising, and at least one of these is familiar from Sartre. He calls it anguish. Jennifer, the quote that you just made, that's you get a sense from Kierkegaard that one of the things that Kierkegaard is trying to tell us is that the leap of faith is not just one specific action that people sometimes do in their life, but I think de Beauvoir is trying to make this very clear to us that we're always acting in this sea of the 70,000 fathoms deep, and we have and I can the Donald Rumsfeld quote is perfectly relevant here. We're acting among these unknown unknowns. Now, the consequence for any kind of consequentialist ethics like rationality theory or like utilitarianism, just understanding the consequences of any specific action is a tremendous epistemological challenge. And there's so on the one hand, you can say that it's hubristic for anybody to suppose that they've solved all these epistemological problems or these information problems and can give us a solid recommendation of either what to do now or what to do as a general rule. Both of those are extremely challenging. But so I read de Beauvoir as saying that argument is done. The argument over whether we can know what to do now or we can know what law we need forever, both of those arguments are over. There is no such thing. Forget it. Grow up. And what instead we have is, we need to be reasoning with each other about ethical choices in a totally different format. We can't ask each other, if we enact this law, will it always turn out for the best for every person? We can't even ask ourselves, if I do this, will it turn out for the best for everyone affected in every respect? Both of those questions are completely unanswerable. And that's the pragmatic content. I never thought of James in connection to de Beauvoir before. So but one of the things I want to
no more one of the things. We gotta wrap this up.
That's good.
Sorry, I opened up a whole other can of things there, but I was supposed to.
I'm like ready for a cocktail at this point. Yeah.
I don't want to oppress anybody by taking away your freedom for the rest of your Sunday. But thank you guys all for being here, and again, apologies for my not being on time. I will have to blame Los Angeles for this one.
Hey, did you have something? What?
I'm sorry?
Oh, we didn't hear what you just said.
Yeah, you just came back in.
Oh, I said thank you again, everybody, for being here, which was a really stimulating and wonderful conversation. Thank you again to Mark for giving us something to talk about, and again, I'm sorry for not running on time here today, but I couldn't fight. Sometimes Los Angeles wins, basically me versus the city sometimes. And,
but it didn't oppress you. You won through it with your freedom.
Ultimately, it was, thank God, we were able to make this happen. But LA is a tough beast, and if you're outside of LA, what can I tell you? Like I said, hit up Craigslist, and everybody should see the movie The Burbs with Tom Hanks. And you'll understand what's going on behind Kenneth this entire time. The noise will be explained. An unsung classic of the Tom Hanks cinema archive. Anyway, have a great day, everybody, and thanks again for being here.
All right, bye-bye. Thank you, Jenny.
Bye.
Thank you.